Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. I was having a tough time choosing a color scheme for a small Helsmiths of Hashut army, so I painted up 3 different models to help me make a decision. We also have a set of recipe cards to go along with this video, and you can download them and print them out. Details about how to get them will be down in the description below. This video will be divided in 3 sections, one for each color scheme. The first half of each section will be beginner friendly, and will cover the basics and paint the models to a battle-ready quality. In the second half, we'll spend a little more time and add some highlights. So let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the models, I attached them to corks for easier handling, and then undercoated with white primer. I began with a layer of Targor Rage shade on the skin. I'm going to put one more layer over this later, and the end result will be a kind of grayish skin tone. If you'd like to see how to paint a variety of skin tones, check out this video here. Next I painted the beards with Basilicanum gray. Let's paint a model with a purple color scheme, similar to the box art. I started by painting the sash with a mix of equal parts Luxion purple and Sigvald burgundy. This mix makes a really nice, rich purple color. If I find myself making the same mix frequently, I think it's a good idea to mix up a whole bottle of it. That way I only have to mix the color once. I painted the sleeves and skirt trim next with Shyish purple. I'm not too worried if some of the paint gets on the surrounding areas, since I'll be base coating everything else with opaque paint. I'd like the armor to be a really dark bronze color, and I base coated it with Warplock bronze. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for a solid, opaque finish. Next I applied a shade of Nuln Oil on everything so far. When using shade and contrast paints, I like to apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses. Then I'll use the brush to soak up any excess. If you want darker shadows, you could apply a second layer after the first one dries, but I think one layer is enough for me. I painted the armor trim next with Runelord brass, and I applied a second layer after the first one dried. Next I painted the scale mail and hammer with Iron Hand steel. Then I painted the weapon handles and part of the sheath with corn red. I shaded the brass, steel, and red with a mix of equal parts Nuln Oil and Magos purple. I tried out Magos purple on its own first, and the result looked too vibrant, but mixing it with Nuln Oil made a purple shade with the right intensity. With all the base coats and shades done, let's add a few highlights and extra details. I highlighted the edges of the bright cloth first with Genestealer purple. Depending on how dark your base coat dried, you may need to adjust the Genestealer purple. I would add a small amount of Phoenician purple if you need to darken it, or a small amount of white if it needs to be lighter. Next I highlighted the edges of the dark purple cloth with Phoenician purple. If you want a smooth blend, you could dilute the paint with water and apply the highlight as a series of glazes. But since this is for an army and I'm looking to save time, I think I'll stick with a few sharp edge highlights. I highlighted the dark cloth one more time with a very narrow line of Genestealer purple. I want this cloth to look darker than the sash, and if the highlight is too wide, it will look too similar. So I'm trying to keep the line as narrow as possible. You could even skip this highlight entirely if you want to. Next I highlighted the dark bronze with a sharp line of Runelord brass. You could dilute the paint with water and add some glaze highlights for a more blended effect, and you could also add some scratches too. It really comes down to how much time you'd like to spend on each model. Next I highlighted the weapon handles with Mephiston red. I highlighted the edges of the brass armor trim next with a sharp line of Canoptek alloy. I'd like to darken the shadows on the steel part of the weapon, so I built up a few glazes of black paint. Dilute the paint with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, add a thin layer on one side of each facet. Notice how there's barely any paint going on the model, and it dries really fast. Build up a few layers, one on top of the other, until the shadows are as dark as you like. Next, I highlighted all the steel areas with a sharp line of Stormhost silver. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. I painted the teeth with Offwhite, and then I painted the eyes with Blood Angels red. Over a black undercoat, I base coated the gem with moon yellow, leaving a narrow black outline. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, solid finish. I shaded the gem with Karandras green, allowing more paint to pool on the top side of the gem. I think it's easier to turn the model upside down, that way the paint will naturally pool on the top. After the first layer dried, I painted a second layer on the top part to deepen the color. Next, I highlighted the edges with Toxic Yellow. Finally, I added a white dot in the corner. Let's paint a blue and turquoise tinted model next. I started by painting the sash with Terradon Turquoise. I'm not too worried if some of the paint gets on the surrounding areas, since I'll be using opaque paint for those base coats. Next, I painted the sleeves and skirt trim with Leviadon blue. I want this layer to be rich and dark, that way it will be a good base coat for further highlights later. If the finish looks splotchy or uneven, you may want to apply a second layer after the first one dries. I base coated the leather areas next with Blood Reaver flesh, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a solid finish. Next, I shaded everything with a layer of Nuln Oil. I painted most of the armor next with Iron Hand steel, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, opaque finish. I'd like the armor trim to be a really light, pale brass color. I base coated those areas next with Canoptek alloy. This is a fairly weak color, and it will need a second layer, or maybe even a third, for a solid finish. Next, I shaded the steel and brass with Gryph-Charger gray. I really like using this contrast paint to shade metal. If you've seen any of my High Elf videos, I use this shade on a lot of those models. It adds a nice, cold tone to steel and silver. With all the base coats and shades done, let's add a few highlights and extra details. I highlighted the bright cloth first with a mix of about equal parts Sybarite green and Baharoth blue. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Arcane Blue from P3 is a fairly close match. Next, I highlighted the dark blue cloth with Macragge Blue. You could dilute the paint with water and build up a few glaze highlights for a blended effect, but I think I'll stick with sharp edge highlights on this model. I highlighted the dark blue cloth one more time with a very narrow line of Calgar blue. Next, I highlighted the edges of the leather with a sharp line of Night Questor flesh. I think the pale bronze is looking too similar to the steel, so I painted a glaze style highlight with Canoptek alloy. I added it anywhere the blue shade looks too intense or where it dried unevenly. The difference is subtle, but I think it helps distinguish the two metals better. Before I highlight the steel, I darkened the shadows with a glaze of black paint diluted with plenty of water. Make sure to have very little paint on the brush and build up thin layers wherever you want the shadows to be darker. I like to alternate where the shadows and highlights are placed on each facet of the blade. It's not necessarily realistic, but I think it looks visually striking. Next, I painted a glaze highlight of Iron Hand steel on the blade, and any areas of the armor that looked rough or uneven. The shade I applied earlier made the metal dull, and this highlight will restore some of the shine. I like to use this highlight to reinforce the shadows. By applying it on the opposite facets of the blade, it makes the shadows look darker, and I think that makes the metals look more striking from a distance. Next, I painted a very sharp edge highlight with Stormhost silver on all the metal areas. I painted the teeth with Offwhite, and then I painted the eyes with Blood Angel's red. Over a black undercoat, I base coated the gem with Moon Yellow, leaving a narrow black outline. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an opaque finish. Next I shaded the gem with Casandora yellow, allowing more of the shade to pool on the top of the gem. I find it easier to turn the model upside down. That way the paint naturally collects at the top. After the first layer dried, I painted a second one to deepen the color. I highlighted the edges of the gem with a sharp line of toxic yellow. Finally, I added a white dot on the top. I'd like the last color scheme to have a lot of red tones in it. I started by painting the sash with Blood Angel's red. I want this red to be very bright, so I only applied one layer. If you want a richer, deeper color, you could add a second layer. I painted the sleeves and skirt trim next with a mix of 3 parts Flesh Terror's red and 1 part Black Templar. This is a custom mix I use on my Tyranids, and I think it works well on other models too. I'd recommend mixing up your own pot of this color. The contrast range doesn't have a really dark red, and I think a mix like this can help round out the range of available colors. I want the armor to be a really dark steel, almost black. I mixed about 3 parts Iron Warriors and 1 part black paint. Iron Warriors isn't quite dark enough for me, but the difference is subtle. If you don't want to mix anything, you could just use Iron Warriors instead and apply a second shade over the top of it later. Next, I shaded over everything with Nuln Oil. If you want the steel armor to look darker, you could paint a second layer after the first one dries. I painted the scale mail and sword next with Iron Hand steel, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, opaque finish. I painted the armor trim and remaining details with Runelord brass next, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second. Next I shaded the steel and brass with a mix of equal parts Targor Rage Shade and Karaberg Crimson. I tested out each shade separately first, and I thought Karaberg Crimson on its own was too red, and Targor Rage Shade wasn't red enough, so I ended up deciding to mix the two. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use one or the other, whichever one you like the look of more. With all the base coats and shades done, let's add some highlights. I highlighted the bright fabric with a few sharp lines of Wild Rider red. Next I highlighted the dark red fabric with a sharp line of corn red. You could paint a few glazes instead if you want a blended result. I highlighted the dark red one more time with Tuskgore fur. I recently started using this color more frequently for highlighting a dark red, rather than using something like a bright orange to highlight, and I really like how it keeps the red looking dark and muted. Next I painted a sharp edge highlight on the dark steel armor with Iron Hand steel. I I think the sword could use some darker shadows, so I added a few glazes of black paint. Dilute the paint with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, build up a few layers, one on top of the other. Next, I highlighted the sword with a few glazes of Iron Hand steel. I like to focus the highlights on the opposite side of the shadows. Next, I highlighted the edges of the sword and scale mail with a sharp line of Stormhost silver. I highlighted the edges of the bronze next with a sharp line of Canoptek alloy. I painted the teeth with Offwhite, and then I painted the eyes with Blood Angel's red. Over a black undercoat, I base coated the gem with Baharoth blue, leaving a narrow black outline. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for an opaque finish. Next, I shaded the gem with Gryph-Charger gray, allowing more of the paint to accumulate on the top portion of the gem. After the first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. I highlighted the edges of the gem next with a sharp line of gray cere. And finally, I added a dot of white on the top. I assembled the models with superglue, and then I made Ash Wasteland bases following this guide here. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you. I think I'm leaning towards either the red or purple for my army. Both of those color schemes were fun to paint, and I feel like they could be a good fit for the army theme. I also like the colors on the blue model, but to me it looks too bright, and blue just doesn't feel like it fits with the army. I think that color palette would be much better suited for something else, like Lumineth. How do you decide on a color scheme for your army? Is every color an option? Or do you rule out certain colors for lore or design purposes? Drop a comment below and start the conversation. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.